Greetings. Jesus had been laying low in Tyre, and then he went to a city called Amicoris Libnath. I'm probably butchering the name. I tend to do that. Anyways, we are now Tuesday, June 27th, 30 AD, and the month of Tammuz the 7th. Jesus taught the whole day at the house of his host in an open court surrounded by columns, over which an awning was stretched. The master of the house came and went. There were gathered in the court very many Jews, men and women of all ages. I did not see Jesus performing any cures. Indeed, there were no sick nor cripples. The people here were lank and lean, but very tall. Jesus gave an instruction on baptism and promised to send some of his disciples hither to baptize. Accompanied by the master of the house, he went out on the road by which the slaves had returned from their work. He spoke to them, encouraged them, and explained to them a parable. There were many good people who were very much touched. They again received food and wages. It reminded me of the parable that speaks of the Lord of the vineyard paying the day laborers. The slaves dwelt in a row of hut about a quarter of an hour from Simeon's. It was some kind of serfdom that they were discharging by their labor for Simeon. On one of the following days after Jesus had been preaching from early morn and the Jews had gone away, about 20 pagans came to him. For several days they had been asking to be allowed to do so. Simeon's was about a half an hour from the city, and the pagans dared not approach beyond a certain tower or arch. But Simeon himself brought these newcomers to Jesus, whom they saluted reverently and begged to instruct them. He spoke for a long time with them in a hall, so long indeed that the lamps were lighted before he finished. He consoled them, told them in a parable of the holy three kings, and said that light would one day shine upon the pagans. Wednesday. When the two disciples whom Jesus had sent to Capernaum returned to him at Sichor, they told him that the 4 disciples whom he had summoned were coming. Thursday, June 29th. Jesus went a journey of from 3 to 4 hours over a mountain to meet them, and came up with them at an inn in Galilean territory. There were, besides those that had been called, 7 others, and among them John. Some women also had come with them, of whom I recognized Mary Mark of Jerusalem and the maternal aunt of the bridegroom Nathanael. Those called were Peter, Andrew, James the Less, and Nathanael Chancellor. Although it was already dark, Jesus walked with the 4 and the 2 other disciples back to Sichor, but the 7 that had not been called returned to Galilee. It was an exceedingly delightful night. The sky was clear and a delicious fragrance embalmed the air. They walked sometimes all together, sometimes before or after Jesus, who then went on alone. Once they rested in the midst of a very fertile region under trees laden with fruit, and in the neighborhood of green meadows and running brooks. As they started again, there rose up from the meadow a flock of birds that accompanied them on their way. They were almost as large as hens, had red beaks, and long pointed wings like those with which angels are painted. And as they flew, they kept up with the funniest twittering. The birds followed them even into the city, and there lighted among the reeds in the water. They could run on the water like waterfowl. It was a touching sight, the beautiful night, Jesus pausing from time to time to pray or to teach, and the birds settling around the little party of travelers. Thus did they climb the mountain and descend on the other side. Simeon came forward to meet them, washed the feet of all, presented them a cup to drink and a morsel to eat in the vestibule, and then conducted them into his house. The birds, or waterfowl, belonged to Simeon. They flew around like pigeons. Friday, June the 30th. Jesus taught here during the whole day, and in the evening they celebrated the Sabbath in Simeon's house, which was very high. Besides Jesus and the disciples, there were present about 20 Jews. The synagogue was in a subterranean vault and arranged in perfect order. A flight of steps led down to it. A leader sang and read in the synagogue, after which Jesus delivered a discourse. The disciples slept in the same house as Jesus. Saturday, July the 1st. We are Tammuz 11 right now. Their sleep was only a few hours long, for the gray dawn found them again on their way. They journeyed through the crooked mountain passes to a little Jewish city in the land of Chabul, where dwelt some other Jewish exiles who had frequently implored to be allowed to return to their country, but the Pharisees would not permit it. Long had they sighed for a visit from Jesus, though they deemed themselves unworthy of it, and for that reason had refrained from sending for him. But now Jesus went on his own accord. The winding mountainous roads made it a journey of from 5 to 6 hours. When they neared the little Jewish city, 2 of the disciples went on ahead to notify the ruler of the synagogue of Jesus' coming. Although it was a Sabbath, Jesus had undertaken this journey, for here in the country, when necessity intervened, he did not strictly observe this law. He went to the rulers of the synagogue, who received him with great humility. They washed his feet, also those of the disciples, and offered them a luncheon. Then Jesus had himself taken around to all the sick, about 20 of whom he cured. Among them there were people quite deformed and lame, women afflicted with an issue of blood, others blind, dropsical, and leprous, also many children. As he went along the streets, several possessed cried out after him, and he freed them from the evil spirit. Order and silence reigned throughout the city. The disciples helped their master. Some assisted the cured to rise. Some instructed the crowd that followed Jesus and gathered around the doors of the houses into which he had entered. Before curing some of the sick, Jesus exhorted them to faith and amendment of life. Others who already believed he cured at once. Raising his eyes to heaven, he prayed over them. Some he touched. Over others he passed his hand. I saw too that he blessed water and sprinkled people with it, directing the disciples to do the same to the house. In one of the houses he and the disciples accepted a little wine and a morsel of bread. Many of the cured, rising up, cast themselves at his feet and then followed him joyously, as we here follow the Blessed Sacrament, though always reverently and at a distance. But to others again, Jesus gave a command to remain in their homes. He directed some of the cured to bathe in the water that he had blessed. These were the children and the leprous. Jesus went to a well near the synagogue and blessed it, casting in it same time salt that he had previously blessed. This well was very deep. A flight of steps led down to it. He taught on this occasion of Elisha, who with salt had rectified the water near Jericho. Then he explained the signification of salt. He furthermore commanded that the people, when sick, should use the water of the well for bathing purposes. He always blessed in the form of a cross. While he was thus engaged, the disciples held his mantle, which he sometimes laid off, and handed him the salt that he threw into the water. He performed all these ceremonies with great gravity and recollection. During this vision, I saw interiorly that a similar power to heal is given to priests. Some of the sick were brought to Jesus on beds, and he cured them. He delivered a discourse in the synagogue, but he took no repast, for the whole day he was spent in teaching and healing. On the evening after the Sabbath, he left the place with his disciples. On taking leave of the inhabitants, who were distressed to see him go, he ordered them not to follow him, and they obeyed humbly. He had blessed and purified the water for them because it was bad and full of snakes and animals with thick heads and long nails. About 2 hours from this place, Jesus and his disciples put up at a large inn among the mountains where they ate and slept. On their journey to the Jewish city, they had passed this inn at some distance. Sunday, July the 2nd. The next day, crowds of people bringing their sick gathered in the mountain inn, for they knew that Jesus had come. They were people that lived in huts and caves on the opposite sides of the mountains. On the west side, towards Tyre, dwelt the Pagans, who also had come, and on the east side, poor Jews. Jesus gave an instruction in which he spoke of purification, of ablutions, and of penance, and cured about 30 persons. The pagans remained at a distance, and Jesus did not teach them until the others had retired. He addressed to them a consoling instruction that lasted till after midday. These poor people had little gardens and plantations around their caves. Their principal nourishment was sheep's milk, which they made into cheese and ate like bread. The fruits of their gardens, as also those that they gathered growing wild, they carried around the country for sale. Many of them likewise furnished the dwellers. In the little city where Jesus had on the preceding day blessed the water with good water, which they carried thither in leathern bottles. Some other places were provided by them in like manner. There were many lepers among these people for whom Jesus blessed water in which they might bathe. Toward evening, Jesus returned to Emmerich, where he again taught and announced that on the following day he would baptize. Monday, July the 3rd. In the court of the large mansion belonging to Simeon, there was a round, shallow basin from which the water overflowed into a surrounding trench. Here too the water was not good, it had a bad taste. Jesus blessed it, casting into it at the same time salt in lumps like stone. In this region there was a whole mountain formed of salt. In that basin, which had been previously drained and cleansed, the baptism of about 30 persons took place. The master of the house with all the males of his household, some other Jews of the place, many of the pagans that had lately been with Jesus, and some of the slaves from the huts were baptized. These last Jesus had on several different occasions instructed when returned from their work. The pagans were the last to be baptized. They had to prepare themselves for the ceremony by certain purifications. Jesus poured from a flask into the baptismal basin some of the Jordan water, which the disciples always carried with them, and then he blessed it. The trench around the basin was filled high enough for the neophytes to stand in it up to the knees in water. Before administering baptism, Jesus prepared the aspirants by a long instruction. These latter were long gray mantles with hood over their head, something like the mantles worn in prayer. When about to step into the trench around the basin, they laid aside the mantle. Their loins were covered, as also the back and breast, while from the shoulders fell a little open mantle like a scapular. A disciple laid one hand upon the shoulder of the neophyte, the other upon his head. The baptizer, in the name of the Most High, poured over his head several times from a flat shell water dipped from the basin. First Andrew baptized, then Peter, who was afterward relieved by Saturnin. The pagans were baptized last. The ceremony, including the preparations, continued until near evening. When people had retired, Jesus and the disciples left the place separately. They met again on the road and went eastward toward Adama on Lake Merom, resting by night in the beautiful high grass under the trees. Subtext: Jesus in Adama, miraculous conversion of an obstinate Jew. Tuesday, July the 4th. Although Adama did not appear very distant still, Jesus and the disciples had to journey some hours up a river before reaching a crossing place. There was no ferryman, but only a raft of beams, something like a gridiron, which lay on the shore for the accommodation of travelers. Toward noon, the little troop reached Adama, which was hemmed in on all sides by water. On the eastern side of the city lay Lake Merom. The city was surrounded by a stream, which was at 5 different points crossed by bridges. At the bathing gardens, the stream again united with the lake. The steep shores of the low lake were covered with thick reeds and undergrowth, and its waters were muddy except in the middle, where those of the Jordan flowed. The country around was infested by wild beasts. As Jesus with the disciples approached the bathing garden near the city, several distinguished men of the place came forward to meet him. They had been awaiting his coming in the garden. They conducted him into the city and to a large open square, in the center of which stood the governor's palace. It had a spacious forecourt on both sides of which, and in the rear ran rows of low buildings. The court was cut off from the street by a railing of shining metal made into various colored plates. Here they washed the feet of both Jesus and the disciples, brushed and shook their mantles, and presented them with a luncheon of small fruits and herbs. It was an old custom of the people of Adama to conduct all that visited their city to this castle, where they interrogated them. If they were pleased with them, they treated them hospitably in the hope of attracting blessings upon themselves. But if they were not favorably impressed by their guests, they did not hesitate to cast them into prison. Adama, with about 20 little districts, belonged to a province under the jurisdiction of some of the Herods. The inhabitants of the city were Samaritan Jews, who, in consequence of their schism, had embraced sundry perverse notions. Still, there was no idolatry practiced among them, and pagans living here had to carry on their idol worship in secret. After that, Jesus was conducted by the men that had received him outside the city to the synagogue, a building of 3 stories. There he had found a great part of the Jews assembled, the women in the background. First they prayed and chanted canticles to God, that to his honor they might understand all that Jesus was about to say to them. Then Jesus began his discourse. He spoke of the divine promises, of their mutual dependence and their realization, and of grace, which, he said, was never allowed to go to waste. If he to whom on account of the merit of his ancestors some grace was given would not receive it, it was passed on to the next most deserving. He told them also of a good action performed by their ancestors in the city so long before that it was to them almost unknown, but the happy results of which they were still experiencing. Their forefathers had once harbored some strangers and exiles. Jesus and the disciples put up at a large inn near the gate by which they had entered the city. In the neighborhood of the bathing garden outside, though more to the south, was a place for teaching, and consisted of a green hill in the center of a large open space in which there were trees planted in rows 5 deep, whose dense shade afforded protection from the sun. On the hill and overshadowed by a tree was a teacher's chair beautifully hewn out of the stone. It was a very delightful place and was known as the place of grace, because the people believed that here a great favor had once upon a time been accorded them. To the north of the city was another place of which there was a popular saying expressive of some great calamity that had come upon them. Wednesday, July 5th. The disciples went into the homes or the houses throughout the city, inviting the people to the place of grace, where Jesus was about to deliver a great discourse. On the evening before, a banquet was given in the public hall of the governor's court. About 50 citizens were present, and 5 tables were spread. Jesus was at that of the most distinguished, and the disciples were scattered among the guests at the other tables. I think Jesus and the disciples also contributed something to the entertainment. Plants like little trees and pots adorned the table. Jesus taught during the meal, going from table to table and speaking to all the guests. When the tables were cleared of all but their ornamental foliage, and Grace said, all present ranged in a half circle before Jesus, who delivered an instruction and invited them to come next morning to the place of grace, where he would discourse to them more at length. And I will cut off the reading here, even though it's sort of in the middle of something, but 20 minutes. All right, so a few notes on this. The first one is the parable of the day laborers is specifically given to pagans because it expresses a group that is employed. The obvious analogy being that some come to God earlier or later than others, but it doesn't mean that they get less in the kingdom of heaven. For the pagans, it means that though God may come to them, it does not follow that they'll be less valuable people than the ones he came to first. And we obviously see that when Christianity went to Europe, that's where it got wealthiest, right? And that's, they didn't receive it first. The Jews got it first, but what did they do with it? Anyways, all the laborers were paid a full day's wage, even though some of them were only employed at 3 p.m, which is in itself could be symbolic, right? They're employed at 3 p.m. They're employed at seeing the death of Christ on the cross. The ones working from the morning complained, and in our times, we still get this. Catholics often complain about new converts as if to say to them, take a seat behind us, whelp, fall in line. But in many cases, the enthusiasm from a new convert can lead them to take on the faith with greater fervor. And we see many a case where Catholic converts are very much influential people. Of course, the example of this is St. Paul, who was himself an adept, nay, a master at converting pagans and Gentiles. All right, so next note. Notice in the text that pagans had extra steps to take before their baptism. Obviously, choosing Christ is done by an act of the will, but the flesh can still be harmed, corrupted, contorted, scarred in some way, so they were baptized last. Notice also that Peter was doing the baptism with Andrew and Saturnin, as though Peter was acting like a priest, though the apostles were direct servants of Christ while he was still present in his person. Notice also that salts were used in water so as to cleanse them. And this calls back to an act that Elisha had done, the prophet Elisha, the one who was the apprentice of the prophet Elijah. Notice also that they bring water from the Jericho with them. When the Spirit talks, it adheres to form because it requests something from the Holy Spirit. The more you adhere to the strictness of the request, the more you understand what you're truly asking for. Water is used from the Jordan, i.e. the Jericho, near Jericho, because it was the very river that the Jews had to cross to go into the promised land flowing with milk and honey. Obviously, it is used for that signification. These things can get lost on us, especially when it comes to our prayer life. This is part of what, when it came to the new liturgy that had come out in the late 60s and early 70s, the reason why the Latin Rite enthusiasts were raising alarms on it is because they had changed a lot of the words in some of the forms, had edited the prayers, and it's like, are you sure you need to be messing with this? What happens if you change the form so much that it weakens the effect, the efficacy of it? And that's just where we have to pay close attention. So it's necessary that when you pray, you tell the Lord that you take him seriously by using a proper form, being in a proper shape, etc., etc. You got to set up your own little home altar. You have to meditate on the mysteries of the rosary, perhaps use some blessed candles, some incense to enhance the experience, etc. You don't do this just for show. You do this so as to say, Lord, you are important to me. The thing the Lord truly looks for, I believe, is sacrifice. That truly tells. It's Genesis 4, right? Abel's sacrifice was a lamb. Cain had just given him some vegetables. And God preferred Abel's sacrifice because it meant more to Abel. So the question is, what does it cost you? It's good to pray when doing other things, yes, because it allows you to stay in a half mode of contemplation, to turn your life into a meditation, to turn your activities into similitudes, to gain wisdom from everything. That's why it's good to pray doing other things. But it's also good that if you're doing daily prayers, you give time to the Lord as an offering, a half hour perhaps. Some people give an hour. But give something. 15 minutes, at least 15 minutes. Do at least 15 minutes. It's not because you're cooking a recipe that calls for exactly a cup and a half of flour and you're overfilling your cup and flattening out the top with a butter knife to ensure that you have the exact amount of flour you need. No. This is a form of communicating to the Holy Spirit, i.e., I offer this. This is why some prayers can or should only be executed by consecrated souls. Someone walks into your house, sees shiny floors, and doesn't take their shoes off, you will, at the very least, note their disrespect, their dishonor of the situation, and take them less seriously, but at the most, you'll scold them and say, you walk in the houses with your dirty shoes on? Now think of how shiny heaven's floors are, and you're bringing prayer requests. Well, you better bring them, and there's actually an anecdote. I just thought of this. There was a dream that St. John Bosco had. And in the dream, he, I don't remember the particulars of the dream, but some people have this on their channel. And one of them, he had his students in the oratory. He often dreamt about them because it's like his dreams were telling them or giving him intelligence on their spiritual progress. And he actually knew which of his students were behind or ahead by the contents of his dream. And he had the gift of being able to look into your soul, right? So on top of that. So in his dream, he would see in this particular dream, he saw his kids. They were offering things to the altar. And some of them offered like a pig or a cat. And some of them offered flowers, though they were dead or wilted. Some of them offered good flowers. And then his angel guardian, who was with him in his dream, who would often be his accompaniment, he told them the signification of these offerings. That his children in the dream were not praying or giving the sacraments the amount of respect that they should be given. And he knew which ones were guilty of this. So, for example, the pig meant it was like desecrated, unholy, because that's what pork or swine meant. It's like the unholy or the outsiders, the unclean. The cat, he said that these kids who offered the cat, they would commit the sins of a cat. They would eat on the sly, for example, and things of the sort. Now, if you want your prayers to be heard, and this text, again, affirms this dream, affirms this effect, that you have to respect the form in which you are committing to your prayer life. So put in the effort, Offer up the mortifications, like the people in Nineveh. Offer up the fasting. Even make your animals fast, because God knows what's in your heart. Excuse me. Now, of course, I'm preaching that to myself. To you, well, it's a suggestion. I hope you listen. All right, last note. A lot of people doubt ancestral or generational curses. I've often come to swordplay online with people about this, but it seems that this text seems to support their existence as the quote-unquote place of grace had become like a spring of blessings for the people of I think it was the township of Adama. We see that hospitality to God or his angels in the Old Testament, and throughout this text clearly leaves a mark, almost like whomever committed the good act has consecrated the space. And when we see the opposite being done in hospitality to God and his angels, i.e. Sodom and Gomorrah, or hospitality to devils, i.e. the pagans, and letting them worship freely in public, the place then becomes desecrated. For example, abortion is desecrating every city everywhere, pretty much. So this is applying to towns and cities, but family functions almost the same. If your ancestry carries a certain type of sin with them, because someone practiced it a lot, you likewise, though you may not understand it, might carry the affliction. Some examples of this are anger, lust, envy, etc. And it may be because that ancestor still suffers in purgatory and you're asked to bear this sin for them, to carry the cross, but you have to cleanse it. You don't bear the sin because it gives you a right to do it. You bear the sin because it requires to be cleansed. And when you cleanse it of yourself, it is like a forgiveness going to your ancestor in purgatory. So, in the spirit of your upbringing, at least, you get marked with vulnerabilities, later exposed by devils. This is why you should be spiritually vigilant. If you shut out the idea upright, it could be taking its toll on you and you wouldn't even know it. Because when we're afflicted by a sin, the first thing that sin tends to do with us is blind us to the affliction, so that less guilt is felt by acting as the sin's conduit. So, it's like when Jesus says, "Why do you look at the speck in your neighbor's eye? Do you not see the log in your own?" It means we're often blind to our own generational curses. So that's it. Ave Maria.